Hello and welcome to News Club UK, a weekly panel show that doesn't just talk about the same old, same old. I'm your host, Thomas Barlow, Chair of the Media Fund, and this week we are joined by Ian Hodson, who's the National President of BFAWU, the union responsible for McStrike and the Spoon Strike, elected by the membership on 3 occasions in 2010. That's what he made sure I put in the bio. We've got Johnbosco Nwogbo, who works as a campaigns officer at public ownership campaigns group We Own It. And yes, I did absolutely massacre his name. You can find it in the description along with his Twitter profile. And finally, Natasha Josette, who is a communications professional and organizer for the Political Education Project. Hello, guys. Thanks for joining us. You all good?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I know you're good. They've all been ripping the out of me cry for this, so thanks very much for the confidence boost, guys. But we're going to be we picked some big topics this week. I mean, huge ones, and it's been a big week for news. So I'm really excited to get into it. We're going to be talking about the biggest strike in human history in India, India's big strike wave. We're going to be talking about Black Lives Matter, Millwall, and Marxism. And we're going to be talking about blocking Brexit deals, or are we? So we've got all of those on the way soon. But we're going to be starting with Natasha Josette, and we're going to be talking about the biggest strike in human history. So let me introduce this topic for you before I bring Natasha back in. We're taking from an article by Jacobin, which is titled, "This is a Revolution, Sir." And it's about the largest strike in human history. Workers in India last week launched a general strike that brought out an estimated 250 million people, arguably the largest in human history. Now they're joining hands with farmers to protest Narendra Modi's pro-corporate far-right agenda. General strikes in the era of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi have an oddly repetitive quality to them. First, the major national level trade unions, save for the one aligned with Modi's far-right Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, call for 1 or 2 day general strike, usually in response to the BJP's latest raft of anti-worker policies. Millions of people across the country pour into the streets in support. Strike leaders tout the action as perhaps the largest strike in history. Left media outside of the country hailed the walkout, while mainstream media in India barely mentions it. And then life seemingly returns to normal. But back in March, the government used the pandemic as an excuse to crack down on and clear the last physical remnants of widespread protests against its discriminatory citizenship laws. And so the sight of people out on the streets in protest was a striking display this time around. Even more importantly, the general strike converged with a march launched by a broad group of farmers' organisations, all planning to descend on the capital of Delhi. Social media was suddenly awash with images of farmers using tractors and trucks to break down the barriers erected by police to keep them out of the city. In one video, a protester emphatically explained to a policeman at the barricades that this is a revolution, sir. So let's bring in Natasha and let's ask some questions about this, because I'm intrigued. I'm very intrigued. And whilst I'm going to continue to try and ask awkward questions, I'm going to have to ask just some dumb questions, because I wouldn't have heard of this if it hadn't really been for you bringing it up and left media. So what is going on here and why is it so important?
Well, I'm going to say that I brought this up not because I'm an expert in Indian politics at all, but mostly because we haven't heard about it and it hasn't really been made much of a story in our media here at all. And that made me kind of question why. And so like the more I looked into it, the more kind of like, I mean, it's 250 million people going on strike is really quite astounding, right? I mean, that is a lot of people and arguably the largest in human history. A strike led by farmers, as well as 10 of India's labour federations who all took part. So we have like a joint labour union statement that reports of successful strikes in the mining industry, employees of postal, telecom, steel sectors, all going in solidarity actions on the same day. I saw this article from a NewsClick. It's an Indian kind of progressive news site that said the strike saw stoppage of work in banks, financial services, various government services, transport, steel unions, port and docks, telecommunications, plantations, power generating units, coal and mine, oil, gas production. Like, there were unemployed workers, women from, like, thousands of women workers, healthcare workers, all in solidarity actions. I mean, like, it's just astounding that the kind of level of solidarity, and 250 million people. And it just, like, we hardly heard about it here. And it just made me really want to question and bring this to News Club, because, like, why is this not being on the headlines?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me if, like, we got 250 million people to do anything together, like, I don't know, jump up and down once or something, it would make global news. Like,
I mean, the earth would shake.
Yeah, probably everyone would fall through, right? Like, I mean, that's what would happen, science. But you know, it seems like if 250 million people did something very trivial together, it would make global news and everyone would talking about it. But because people are doing something very serious, but something that also challenges, you know, both the government, but also, like, the power of big business, really, and these strikes sort of seem to be against sort of big business as much as the government.
Well, it's definitely like corporate interests who are calling the shots, and work is getting crushed under the pressure, and all during a global pandemic. And in that context, you have people, solidarity movements, as well as the labor movement and farmers, all coming out in strike against a right-wing government. And no one is talking about it, which makes me kind of think, well, why do they not want us to know that there are movements around the world who are rising up?
Now, it might be that we're talking just a lot about COVID at the moment. We've got Brexit on. Obviously, some stuff happened at football club. We're going to be talking about those things. Mm-hmm. And there's a piece on the BBC website and stuff like that. So do you think this is just a normal case of the British media going, if it's not happening here or the US, we're not really interested? Because that seems to be the way that the media has gone in the past decade, especially. Or is there something more about what it is that the strike is doing?
Well, it's definitely more, because, like, it's quite challenging when you've got Joint Labour Federation who are asking for demands that include, like, minimum income, food for poor families, guaranteed number of work days, higher wages, pensions for everyone, and end of forced retirements. I mean, like, they're calling for the government to stop privatizations, as well as addressing the anti-farmer laws and anti-worker labour codes. And you have that in the context of the rise of the far right all around the globe. And I mean, maybe unsurprisingly, 250 million people on strike barely made the headlines here. I mean, I was scrolling through my Twitter feed this morning when I was thinking about coming on this afternoon, and I saw that a Labour MP for Slough, Tandese, brought these protests and violence used against the protesters by Modi's government forces to PM Johnson, and asked if he believed in the fundamental human right to be allowed to, for people to be allowed to protest peacefully. And, like, the look on Tan's face when Johnson replied really said it all. I mean, he was just absolutely horrified, because Johnson stood up and said, "We have serious concerns about what is happening between India and Pakistan. And these matters are between the two governments to settle." It was just like, huh?
Wow, I had missed that. I hadn't been. Again, we've had a Brexit day in PMQ, so I hadn't noticed that he had conflated an internal.
I mean, just like, and you just say, so my instinctive response, apart from just to kind of be horrified, was also like, was this yet another sign of Johnson's ignorance mixed with, you know, arrogance, not paying attention to the question, that he was disinterested in other parts of the world, as we'd expect from, like, Johnson's casual blundering through his leadership? But I just kind of feel like also, I mean, that's partly true, but I also kind of feel like there's almost something a little bit deeper going on, where we have this kind of axis of far right growing from Bolsonaro, Trump, Modi regimes around the world. And we also have a rise of movements who are organizing against them. And where, like, capitalism is failing, people rising together with alternatives, and these movements around the world are met with extreme state violence and brutality. And the establishment, specifically here, the establishment media, playing a part in downplaying or misinterpreting, misrepresenting the uprisings, you know, not reporting student protests, not reporting the murders of climate justice campaigners. I mean, look at the, you know, I got in the post this morning, my this month's Red Pepper, and like the first few pages, we've got photographs from Thailand, Indonesia, Mexico, Belarus, all these kind of protests around the globe. And that's just this year alone. And the establishment aren't going to feed us the news that would inspire us to organize change against them.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's easy to laugh off Johnson's blundering and his funny hair and his zip-lining, flag-waving personality, rather than question what is really going on and why they don't want us to transform it.
Yeah, and Johnson uses that appearance of being stupid and blundering, you know, to not answer questions directly. Like, that's a technique, right? You know, that's not a mistake. He you know, that's a like, you know, people have regularly reported that he ruffles his hair before getting out of a taxi, and he makes sure that he looks as disheveled as possible. It's a facade, it's an act. So, and we've seen that, like, again, I can't be bothered mostly. That I find most politics in Parliament performative. But if you do bother to watch Prime Minister's Question Time or anything where he's asked a question, he doesn't answer a single question, like not one. And he doesn't even include a kernel of a reference to the question in his answer. He'll talk about something completely different. And it's done in a way so as you could laugh it off as if he was stupid, but you can't be so stupid as to never answer a question. That has to be a either unconscious, but probably very conscious, you know, methodology to deal with difficult questions and to divert us. Now, talking about diverting us, there doesn't seem to be genuinely a discussion about what challenges unions and workers are going to be facing this winter and in the new year, because those things are going to be occurring. And as you say, we don't report on global strike conditions. And I thought, is there going to be anything that drives people here to strike? Are we going to see similar types of actions, or are we certainly going to at least be challenged in the way that we see in, say, India and all over the world?
Well, I mean, this winter and definitely into the new year, we're going to see workers impacted by job losses, right? And alongside this, we've got benefit cuts, low wages, inadequate sick pay during a pandemic, rise in child poverty. Like, the challenges go way beyond the workplace. And I think this is where we can actually really take time to learn from the global movements, and certainly like worker-led movements in the global south, like, for instance, the strike in India, where we're talking about actions by unions that are all joined up with like broader social movements from students, climate justice, Black Lives Matter, coming together to rise up against economic and political injustice. Like, that is possible. And we've got examples throughout history and throughout the world right now that are doing it. And, you know, we have to kind of really see that this pandemic and the government response bring to the surface existing inequalities. You know, we need to be organised and be politically educated working class movement in all our diversity that is rooted in our communities to counter the political and the media establishment at every level. And like, we can't not do it.
Yeah, well, hopefully News Club is part of that. And also, let's quick shout out to Opus Independence and Now Then, who support this channel and the Media Fund. Please check them out. Links are in the description, or just Google them, or use a different search engine. Ecosia, they plant trees for every search you make. And I'm going to bring everyone in after these questions, this sort of last question, which is there anything outside of trade unions and the union movement in the UK that can give us hope? And what kind of things can people, you've talked broadly about, like, okay, we can have unions that should be allied with movements that are in the community. Are there anything specific that you think people can start working on to help tackle these coming winter crises that we're going to see with flooding as well, and potentially, you know, trade problems and potentially food shortages?
Are you asking, is there hope?
Is there hope? Is there hope, and can we do something?
Is there hope? I'm an organizer. There's always hope. I mean, like, before looking at the UK, I think it's kind of just want to stay out, like a bit more international, and kind of draw from other parts of the world for inspiration. So we've looked at India, but this year we also had, for example, in Chile, where 78% of people voted to rewrite their constitution that had been in place since a right-wing government in Pinochet in the 80s. And this wasn't just a win for parliamentary democracy, which you've already said you're not that keen on. This was performative. This wasn't performative. This was a win for people after years of civil unrest, and they have organized and mobilized against a right-wing repressive government and faced daily violence, and they won. And I think, like, having those kind of that hope and inspiration from around the world, we can actually kind of then look at how we organize here and draw from their experiences and offer our solidarity to them at the same time. I mean, one of the easiest thing that kind of was quite inspiring at the beginning of lockdown was how the mutual aid groups just kind of completely took off, and working class people really stepped up for one another when the government didn't. And those are opportunities to continue our political education and continue being politicized. And then there are, you know, other amazing things kind of kicking off in the last few months, like student rent strikes that started in Manchester and now kind of snowballed through Cambridge and Bristol unis. And before that, we've got the young climate strikers, or global climate strikers, who are asking for a global Green New Deal, where they are like the next generation of leaders who are coming up and who are talking about putting anti-racism and anti-capitalism into the climate justice movement. And that's kind of really big and really hopeful, because we can't avert the climate crisis without dealing with those two things and making them central to our organizing. So yeah, there is hope. We get organized, we self-educate, and we have.
I presume through self-education they can get involved with the political education project that you're part of.
You can, of course. Good plug, like it.
There we go. So okay, I just wanted to see if Ian and Johnbosco here had any questions for you or any considerations. And I'll start off with Johnbosco. You know, do you take inspiration from what's happened in India, and are there any lessons you think we could learn? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm from, I may have mentioned this before, I'm from Nigeria, and for the first time in a long time in Nigeria, we recently had protests against police brutality. And I suppose I could draw some parallels between what happened in Nigeria recently and what's happening in India right now. But I'm also always quite dubious about things as they happen, where they happen, and the way they are presented in the Western press, and not just from the point of view of whether or not those things are presented unfairly, in terms of how significant they are, whether they are presented as not very significant, or on the other hand, on the left, whether they're presented as more significant than they actually are, right? And the sense I have gotten, and I think that Sasha could probably kind of speak to this as well, is it appears that that the coverage we have not seen coverage on the part of those who would traditionally underplay the significance of this kind of as the man at the barricade called it, this kind of revolution. And on the other hand, it appears that we are seeing a kind of traditional left-wing over-exaggeration of the significance of these kinds of quote-unquote revolution, right? So I'm wondering if Sasha could speak to this. How can we guarantee? Because I don't know enough about this, but I do know that right-wing to centrist media in the UK has a tendency to underplay the significance of these kinds of movements, and left-wing media has a tendency to overplay the significance of these kinds of movements. How do you see that shaping up in this case?
An interesting one in this case, because I don't think the left or the right have particularly picked up this news story. we had a few articles. I mean, we had this Jacobin article that came out, but I didn't see a lot happening. And quite honestly, if I probably wouldn't have come to it if it wasn't for the fact that my mum is an organizer in Southeast, trade union organizer in Southeast Asia, and she kind of was talking about it a lot. And she's up at like 2 o'clock in the morning because of the time difference, organizing women workers and garment workers out in India and Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. And so that's how I get my information. And the movement is big and it's growing. I definitely do think that it's significant. And I think the left actually need to make a lot more of it. We don't do enough international solidarity on the left. We don't do enough of really learning from movements in the global south. We do potentially have a little bit of exceptionalism within ourselves that we need to look at.
Right, well, talking about weird exceptionalism, I'm going to move us on to the next topic. And Ian, maybe you can speak to the general strike a little bit in this part, because we're going to be talking about Millwall fans, Marxism and Black Lives Matter. So let me introduce this story. We've used the Daily Mail to show that no source gets unused here, no matter what it's like. So here's the story. Millwall fans applaud as players link arms carrying anti-racism banner before some take the knee after controversy over boos before Saturday's match. QPR players all took the knee, and the Millwall side linked arms ahead of last night's game after fans had booed footballers for associating with the, in quotes, extreme Black Lives Matter group on Saturday. Millwall players held an anti-racism banner that said inequality with the in crossed out on the halfway line in the Den in South London, in a nod to the club's new United for Change initiative. The referee and QPR side then took a knee in a show of solidarity just days after crowds berated players at Millwall's derby fixture for dropping to the ground ahead of kickoff. Players were braced for repeated hostility after supporters defended the actions of Saturday's hecklers, who were supposedly lashing out at the, again, in quotes, extreme political views of the BLM movement. The act of taking the knee is now closely associated with BLM, which has been accused of straying beyond its anti-racism origins and becoming a brazen left-wing political organisation. BLM, which came to global prominence after George Floyd's death, has called for the abolition of the police and the capitalist system, which has underpinned Western society since 1945, according to the Daily Mail. And that's meant with all the satire it's supposed to. So, Ian, I'm going to bring you in now. Even amongst the left, and this is where I start asking the awkward questions, really, where I can really get into them. Even amongst the left, it's recognised that the BLM movement in the UK is renowned for being more explicitly anti-capitalist than its American counterpart. Isn't it fair for Millwall fans to show their disgust with anti-capitalism? Isn't that their right?
I mean, I've heard this, you know, that the Black Lives Matter in the UK is profoundly anti-capitalist. But what I've never heard on the media was like when Pope John Paul II said he was an anti-capitalist, and we suddenly condemned all the Roman Catholics in the country as being too extreme to allow the Pope into the country, or we said that we should boo him when he walks down the street. I mean, I think the idea that we start booing people for showing that they recognise that we have a serious issue where people are discriminated and killed by taking the knee, I think is a poor show. And you know, I mean, you often hear, don't you? You often hear about the politicisation of Black Lives Matter and it being used for politicisation purposes by footballers. But I think the far right groups have their own issue about what they've tried to politicise over the years. I mean, you think of the EDL and the number of clubs that have EDL soccer fans attached to it. You know, the little cults that they have. The West Ham EDL people. I know we have them in Bolton and Blackpool EDL. You know, so I don't think really the far right can suggest that the Black Lives Matter is politicising football, because they've been doing it for quite a number of years.
Yeah, well, that may be the case, but isn't it also fair for the Millwall fans to be pulled by the idea of defunding the police? I mean, isn't that what the Millwall fans were doing?
Well, if they were, I mean, hopefully they didn't vote Tory, because over the last 40 or 50 years, the Tories have been defunding the police. I mean, you're more likely to get arrested for speeding your car than finding somebody to come round after you've been burgled, because we haven't got enough police officers to deal with people who are getting their houses burgled, have we? I mean, the reality is, the police have been used now really as a resource and capital means of bringing cash in, rather than actually doing the job of protecting our communities. So I think if you've got an issue with defunding the police, I think you should take it up with the mainstream political parties that have been doing it consistently.
Okay, last awkward question, and sometimes I hate myself for saying these things, but aren't people just kind of tired of the wokeness being pushed by the BBC and the Premier League here? Like the BBC, specifically on Match of the Day, they show people taking the knee before every match still. And this is after the Premier League said it's not compulsory to do it any longer, but it's still being done. Is this just fatigue?
No, I just think it's the way that the media wants to present it. I mean, you only have to go to the Black Lives Matter website to find out that actually what they're reporting isn't true. I think we've got lazy journalists in this country. I mean, they actually don't say anything about being connected to any political organisation. And I think actually Black Lives Matter, in reality, the only political demand they've actually made in their being is that we actually enact the Equality Act of 2010, because that great Marxist David Cameron at the time was promoting that. I mean, obviously, I know looking at today's Labour Party, maybe you would see David Cameron to the left of Keir Starmer. I don't know, but the reality is, is that's about the most political demand that Black Lives Matter has actually made in the UK.
Right. Okay, I wasn't aware of that. Because I was, I'd have said, what's wrong with it being associated with being left wing? I mean, yes, if left wingers are anti-racist, then maybe people should, get on board. But the question does, if you've got involved in this, one of the questions is do you think this action of taking the knee will make any change? Is it worth doing? Is it something that's having an impact?
Well, I think absolutely is. I mean, we saw the other night, didn't we, with two football teams in Europe taking the decision to walk off the pitch because a fourth official thought it was okay and justified to be give racial abuse to people from the Turkish football team. So I think it's great that people are demonstrating their support and bringing attention to this issue, because it is about time we realise that we're stronger when we stand together than we'll ever be when we stand apart. The people who benefit from keeping us divided is the people that's always benefited, the people at the top. It always surprises me how the far right always want to talk about and exploit the hardship that's caused by capitalism and then become its great defenders. Because for me, the reality is if you change the system and you start to say that people should be treated fairly and equally, then you can't divide people, and then we can get on with making sure that society is built on fairness that enables us all to prosper, instead of just those with the richest at the top of that were born fortunate into the right family. I mean, I don't know anybody who chose which family they could be born into. I suppose people on the far right would tell me different.
Yeah, I think that would be a difficult argument to make, though. So you
make it.
Yeah, I can't do it. Honestly, can't. There's only so far I can go down that rabbit hole myself. I know I've seen some sites where they make some. It's weird how the far right in Britain does different things to the far right in the US. So there's a bunch of them that do get behind the royal family and stuff like that, and yet a lot of the far right and the working class are quite rightly revolted by them. So it is a confusing mishmash of ideas that they try to justify for being just hateful and bigoted. But talking about, you mentioned Keir Starmer, and it brings me onto the question of what we can do about this. This is something we like to ask here, which is, what can trade unions, the Labour Party and wider society do to meaningfully act on this now? because it seems to me that football and footballers are taking more of a lead than many other elements of society. Again, you see it again in politics. Marcus Rashford seems to be more like the leader of the opposition than, you know, the one who's in Parliament. What do you think can be done, and where do you think people should be going and putting their energy into to make change in this arena?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether Marcus Rashford was intending to do the things that he intended to do before the challenge was thrown down by the Tory party at the start of the COVID crisis, when they were telling the football players to stand up. But one thing's for certain, he has demonstrated as a young man, as a young black man, about how connected he is and understanding of the community that he originates from. And I think, you know, politicians would do well to take a lead and listen to people like Marcus Rashford, because they've got personal experience and they haven't forgotten where they've come from. They haven't used the opportunity that they've been given, you know, he's been given, to distance himself. In fact, what he wants to do is put something back into the society that's given him the opportunities. And I think, you know, Gary Neville was absolutely right when he talked about Keir Starmer, you know, sitting in the stands, you know, instead of putting out an opposition. I think United did that the other night against that German side, but we won't go down there because obviously I'm not talking about Brexit.
Okay, well,
otherwise we're talking about.
Some of us didn't mind seeing that occur, you know. So I mean, but yeah, it's hard for some of us who've grown up hating United to appreciate both a United footballer and an ex-footballer, you know, who are taking moral leadership that politicians aren't. And, you know, it'd be fair to say that I think even the union movement could be seen to, it could be more involved in some areas. Do you think that's fair to say, or do you think there's particular actions the union movement could take? Because certainly the Labour Party could do better, it seems to me. But
yeah, no, I would totally agree. I mean, the educational system that needs to happen in our workplaces, I think, is essential to make people understand. You know, I mean, I was talking last year with Clive Lewis about the opportunity to put forward about how we deal with this issue of divide and rule, because, you know, it impacts on our ability to improve terms and conditions in workplaces. If people are divided, then you know, obviously employers will use that division to make sure that we are not able to achieve the full fruits of our labour. So I mean, for me, you know, building that understanding about why we have to work together and why it's in our interest to support one another, regardless of where we come from, regardless of what our religion is, regardless of the colour of our skin, you know, regardless of our sexuality, regardless of any issues that they use to divide us. What we need to do is explain to them why we need to be united, and how by being united we can build a better society and a better community for, you know, for not just for us today, but our children of tomorrow, because that's our duty. Our duty is to make life better for people. Yeah,
absolutely. On that quite inspiring note, I'm going to bring in again, I think I'll bring in yourself, Johnbosco. I hadn't planned this clearly, but I just wanted to say, have you been following what happened with Millwall, and do you have any comments or thoughts on or are you even a football fan? Because I guess to a lot of people who aren't football fans, this isn't a big deal. So, you know, that's one of the things I want to say, to even being on your radar.
Yes, I'm a football fan, although I'm not a fan of any English team. I support Barcelona in Spain, but and some clubs in South Africa and Nigeria. Yeah, but I did hear about this incident. What I would just like to say more generally, not just specifically about this incident, is that I think that the press often plays a little bit of, and the British establishment as a whole often plays a game with us in terms of they are very quick and all too eager to emphasize the what people often derisively call the virtue signaling element of anti-racism. And I don't want to call it virtue signaling, because it's extremely important to be outwardly anti-racist. But I think that the job of actually being anti-racist is not just the job of showing yourself to be anti-racist in public, although that is important. I think more importantly, the job of being anti-racist is that of actually engaging people in kindness and humility who have views that you may consider to be racist, right? That is the way to change minds. To be an anti-racist, to me, is to work toward reducing the number of actual racists that are in the world, and to the extent that those Millwall fans are racists, I think that we should be talking about what we need to do to engage them in kindness and humility. And this might sound a little bit like naive, right? But my instinct is that just coming down on them quite strongly. And I saw the statement by Rooney, who I did not realize was a manager at Millwall or one of those clubs there. I was really excited when I saw that because I love Wayne Rooney. But I saw his statement and he was being a little bit preachy at those people. And I thought that was not very impressive of him. But generally speaking, I'm much more.
Oh, well, we've lost Johnbosco there for a tick, but that gives me an opportunity to bring in Sasha. Sasha, two questions then. One, have you even heard about what's going on? And by the way, Wayne Rooney is the manager of Derby, who were playing Millwall at the time. So it was kind of his position to make a comment on that. And I think he was quite forceful. So that's just to clarify that. But secondly, then, do you think preachy or like, is it important to be stridently anti-racist? Oh, and we just need to get your mic unmuted. No. Oh, you've muted yourself. Sorry, apologies. Oh, there we go.
There we go. I do actually know who Wayne Rooney is. By the way, I'm the only girl here.
Audience, not everyone is like. It's not on that basis.
No. I actually very vaguely heard the story, but I think it's in terms of being anti-racist and actually making sure that we do that and embed that into our organising and who we are. I mean, like, I genuinely think that the left haven't done enough around this. I think the trade union movement really need to do more around this. And I say this with a trade unionist heart, and with a bit of sadness as well, because actually some of the worst racism, kind of aggressive racism I've ever had in my adult life was at Durham Miners Gala. And so I don't think we can assume that because we're left and trade unionists that you're going to be surrounded by comrades who are anti-racist. And I think if we don't deal with that and deal with it really fast, that space is going to be filled and completely filled by the far right, which it is already, particularly in the digital realm. And we need to counter that, and we need to counter it quickly. And that means doing as much as we can in every single space that we inhabit.
Ian, I'll bring you in for some last comments and thoughts there. What do you make of Sasha's and Johnbosco's comments? And, what do you think practically can be done around this issue?
Like I say, I mean, to me, I think Sasha's right, and I think Johnbosco's right. We can't be too preachy. That's absolutely true. It is about education. It's about making sure people, like I say, people understand the importance of working together. We do more and achieve more by standing together than we'll ever do apart. The only victors, in being divided are those that want to maintain the status quo. And it's in all of our interests to understand that. And I do agree. That as a trade unionist, we cannot just rely on the idea that because we have rules and we have motions to our conference that demand people to act a certain way, that people will. But like I say, it's our duty to make sure that we give a good shot at making sure people understand the importance of why we have to be with one voice and as one people.
I think that's a fair point, and I'd just like to add that I think there is a difficult line that a lot of people are trying to work out how to walk at the moment, which is not being associated with the most preachy and puritanical elements of, say, certainly Twitter behavior, for instance, of a certain section of people on certain elements of social media, but stridently tackling this. And I think sometimes we give too much ground because we're afraid of being associated with a small element of knobheads on Twitter. And realistically, and we start to malign words like identity politics and virtue signaling, and we're arguing more about that than we are arguing about the rise of racism, sexism, homophobia, all far-right ideologies that divide us in our communities, divide us at workplaces, divide us around the world. And more than ever, we're in a situation where we have global problems that need global solutions, and we need to come together as one species at certain points to deal with some of these things, like Amazon, and certainly the work of, say, Progressive International and stuff like that are worth looking at. So I think, you know, that won't provide any answers for anyone. It's just a steer from my personal point of view, stepping outside of the role of the chair. I will go back to being the host now, and we will move on to Brexit. We had to talk about it. We'd got 5 shows in and we'd managed to avoid it, but we'd done it a bit with the Green Party, actually, but we're now really going to go in deep. We're going to go in deep with the great work that We Own It have been doing. Or is it great work? Let's go to the Express to see what they think about We Own It's work around the Brexit plan. So, Brexit plan under threat. Left-wing activists petition House of Lords to block trade bill. Pro-nationalisation lobby group We Own It are calling on peers to amend the trade bill to ensure NHS services are excluded from all future trade agreements. Tories have already fought off attempts to add an amendment to the bill by Labour in the House of Commons, saying it is unnecessary. The Prime Minister has already promised the NHS will not be for sale in trade talks with other countries. In October, he said, in any future trade negotiations with our country, our National Health Service will never be on the table. But campaigners are hoping to persuade peers to alter the trade bill because they don't trust Boris Johnson's words. They want it written into law that the NHS will be protected in trade deals, and also want to give MPs power to vote on agreements before they come into effect. Now, Johnbosco, isn't this just a ridiculous stunt to hand in a petition on something the Prime Minister has already promised to do?
No, it's not a ridiculous stunt. Fortunately or unfortunately, just to kind of bring you up to date on that Express story. Although the Express themselves have not written an update to that story, the House of Lords did actually pass the NHS amendment that we were submitting a petition for. So they passed the amendment to the trade bill that would expressly protect the NHS in the law. And they also did pass the amendment that would give MPs the power to scrutinize trade deals. Obviously, the trade bill will have to go back to the House of Commons, where MPs will have to kind of vote again on those amendments, although they have already voted on them in the past. And We Own It and a coalition of other NHS campaigning organizations and trade justice organizations will continue to try and put pressure on MPs to vote to keep both amendments in the bill. So from the point of view of whether or not we were effective, it's quite obvious that it was not a stunt, a useless stunt. It was clearly an effective stunt that, in addition to the work that we have already been doing on the background, led to the result we saw. But I don't think that it's unnecessary to kind of ask that the trade bill have on the face of it protections for the NHS, and just the Prime Minister has said that the NHS is off the table. I don't know who in Britain believes the words Boris Johnson says, and we actually have polling that suggests that more people do not believe his words when he says the NHS is off the table in trade deals than do believe him. And there's also a trick that they play when the government plays when they talk about NHS in trade deals. They always talk about how the government has no plans to sell the NHS, and it's not quite clear what selling the NHS actually means in reality. and nobody's alleging that the government is planning to sell the NHS. I don't know that it's actually possible to sell the NHS necessarily. What we are saying is that there are protections within the NHS that make it free at the point of use, keep the price of drugs that the NHS purchases as low as it currently is, one of the lowest in Europe and the US, that protects our patient data that we give to our NHS doctors whenever we interact with them or when we fill out the form online. And all of those protections that we currently have, that, mind you, are already being undermined by privatization of other forms within the NHS at the moment, all of those protections will be kind of rapidly eroded in the context of a trade deal in which the NHS is not protected. I just wanted to read to you a passage from a Mirror story in response to the vote in the House of Lords to pass the protection amendment, just so you could kind of get a sense that we're not speaking about a government that is committed to protect the NHS and trade deals, even though it does say the words that the NHS is off the table. So a minister says that they are already promising to protect the NHS, and the wording of the amendment will effectively rip up any trade deals they've already signed. So if an amendment that would protect the NHS from trade deals would cause you to rip up any trade deals that you've already negotiated, does that not suggest that there is something suspect in that trade deal with respect to the NHS? Right? We're talking about people who are as committed as we are on this issue. So we need to hold them to the promises that they are verbally offering by asking them or forcing them to put it in the law. That is why this is not a useless stunt.
Okay. Well, you've headed off some of the questions because I sneakily let you have them in advance that I was going to ask, but I still think they are valid here to ask, because even if the NHS is in a trade deal, what's the problem with that? Because we could get world-class American leading medical care provided to our patients free at the point of use through the NHS. I mean, what's wrong if we get MRI machines from the US or medical equipment? Why is that a problem?
Yeah, I don't think so. There are two ways to look at that question. So I don't think that that we are necessarily arguing that we should not be able to purchase medical equipment from the US, or that we should not be able to purchase medicines from the US. The amendment specifically that was passed yesterday does not prohibit that. It essentially kind of protects and shores up the frameworks that Britain has for carrying out such purchases. So the UK, for example, has something called NICE. I think it means the National Clinical something. Essentially, that negotiates the price of drugs with drug companies. And because the NHS is the only buyer in the UK, it pretty much decides the price, what it's going to pay for drugs that it buys from the US. And if that system is weakened, which is the explicit intention of US pharmaceutical companies, for example, we could see the NHS paying manifoldly more than it currently pays for drugs. And that would affect, if the NHS is forced to pay more for drugs, it means that more of its budgets goes to drugs and less of its budgets going to purchasing of equipments, refurbishing of hospitals, and building of new rural hospitals where some of that is needed in Britain, and all of that. So we're not saying that we shouldn't be able to purchase medication from the US. The US pharmaceutical companies happen to make some medications that people need in the UK, just as much as they also make some of the medical equipment that we need in the UK. We are essentially trying to shore up the framework for Britain purchasing those things, so that if you want to sell to the NHS, you do so on our own terms. You do not dictate the pricing to us. Otherwise, you don't sell to us, right? So this is a setup this amendment that's put into the trade bill to protect the NHS from having to spend too much, from breaking its budget and the budget for paying staff suffering as a result of all of that, right? So and we are also not in favor. I mean, we're not just against doing this with respect to American companies, for example, or companies from around the world. We are in favor of doing this for British companies as well. You know, we're closing. We want our NHS closed to companies from across the world, not just those from the UK, not just those from across the world.
Well, this is something I was going to bring up, because we already have PFI and PPE, private finance initiatives, private-public partnerships, that have already cut up the NHS to a certain extent. And again, many people would ask, well, what's the problem with this? You know, we still get medication free at the point of use. We still get medical care free at the point of use. Is there any problems with part privatization of the NHS? So far it's working, right?
No, it's not really working. PFIs currently cost the NHS billions of pounds in kind of debt reservicing every year, and so it's not like PFIs just happened and they don't have any consequences on our current NHS budget. And we have to think of it this way: the NHS has a certain amount of money in its budget every year. I believe that the budget for last year was £17 billion. I'm not 100% sure of that right now, but it was something around that. And it uses a portion of that for medications. It uses a portion of that for paying staff. It uses a portion of that for kind of hospital refurbishment and so on and so forth. And if it has to begin to pay more in one portion of that, it has less money to spend in other portions of that, right? And you can imagine a situation where, for example, we are currently having to fight Matt Hancock over pay freezes for nurses and so on and so forth, right? And so I think that private involvement in the NHS has, on the whole, been a negative thing. And we are quite against a private involvement in the NHS for a number of reasons. Number one is that their intentions, the overarching motivation of private companies that get involved in the NHS is profit, right? They could, if you go to their websites and read their quote unquote mission statements, they could cover it up all in all sorts of beautiful kind of language, right? But at the end of the day, they have a fiduciary responsibility to make money for their shareholders, right? Whereas the goal of the NHS is healthcare, right? It's not profit. So any company that comes into the NHS whose primary objective is to make as much money as possible for their shareholders already begins to distort the mission of the NHS. And you will see that some of that plays out in the form of companies because they are trying to maximize their profit, they try and squeeze out as much profit as possible from the amount of money they are paid by the NHS, which hurts the services, hurts their staff, because we also have evidence that the staff, outsourced staff within the NHS, have much worse conditions than staff that are paid by and employed by the NHS, right? So that outsourcing, because of the profit motive, hurts a whole range of elements of that work.
Well, there's one other thing then that I've got to bring up. If you talk about the evils of privatization, and we're talking about trade deals here, specifically, you know, this is what post-Brexit is supposed to be about. It's going to be one of the government's key missions. Is the NHS the only thing worth protecting in these coming trade deals? It seems to me that we talk about it a lot. It's the sort of last bastion of public service, and even as we pointed out, it is being partially privatized. But our water, electricity, gas, railways, postal services, and more are owned by multinational corporations, foreign governments, and private British companies. Aren't there more things under threat post-Brexit, especially like food standards and farmers' livelihoods? So aren't those things under threat as well? And is there any work going on around those that you can point to?
Yes, the scrutiny amendment specifically does not just protect, or does not just provide the framework for MPs to protect the NHS. It also provides the framework for MPs to protect food standards, for example, or environmental standards or employment rights, right? So it's the scrutiny amendment essentially allows MPs to scrutinize trade deals once they're negotiated by the government, and kind of also gives them the power to vote it down if they think it kind of leads to bad consequences in employment rights or environmental protections or food standards and so on and so forth. So that work is extremely important. And if anybody is interested in the environment or in food standards or in any other issues that trade typically deals in, they should definitely get involved in the work that that we are doing and that trade justice movement is doing around the scrutiny amendment. And MPs will also get a say on the scrutiny amendment because the Lords passed that and it's going to come back to the House of Commons. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And just going by the description there that you the list that you outlined, energy and water and so on and so forth. If you went to We Own It's website, it just sounded as though you were reading the things we would like to come back into public ownership. All right, so we would like our water to go into public ownership because that is the best way to secure it as a common belonging of our society. Right, it's not something that people should be making profit from. And recently, you may have seen the report from Ofgem that suggested that households should be paying a little bit more in their energy bills. If you read a lot of the stories, pretty much all of the stories that came out around that report in the main outlets, We Own It was quoted there as calling for the public ownership of energy. Right, so we are working in pretty much all areas where public ownership would be advantageous for the user. We are the voice of public service users across a whole swath of areas, including in energy and water and transportation and healthcare and the NHS and so forth.
Excellent stuff. And yeah, then I'm going to bring everyone in to say goodbye. I was going to ask you what can people do about this, but I'm going to tell them you can check out We Own It. The links are in the description. You can follow Johnbosco, and you can follow We Own It on Twitter and all of those good things. We Own It are doing work on bringing public services and public goods back into public hands than I think any other organisation in the UK, but in alliance with hopefully organisations like the ones that Natasha and Ian represent. So I just wanted to get some final thoughts from you guys on public ownership, and especially if you can even muster this in a complex way, in a brief way, as anything on the BBC, because it is a public body. And in an era where media seems to be more and more difficult to control and to get it to act in the interests of the public, is it something that we should be looking to bring back into, or in fact deepen, public control over? We'll start off with Natasha.
I don't know about BBC. I did quite a lot of community organising last year, so we kind of went all around the country, like Morecambe, Blackpool, deindustrialised towns, ex-mining areas, coastal towns, particularly around like organising around climate policy. And there were a lot of young people in the room, working class young people from towns that had just kind of been destroyed by decades of austerity. And when we started talking about public ownership, I realised that they don't actually remember. That I'm actually old enough, I'm 40 this year, in a couple of weeks. I remember what it was like to have nationalised services. And like, so there's a whole kind of articulation that needs to happen in terms of like how we actually describe and bring people with us when it comes to talking about public ownership and nationalised industries. I'm not quite sure like how to do it. I mean, for me as an organiser, I go and talk to people in their communities and we work stuff out together. But there's a whole kind of, and I think that kind of, when you kind of conflate that again with Brexit, which people, you know, from a comms perspective are just so tired of. This is why the whole like, get Brexit done, it was like an empty narrative, but like people bought it. because it was just like everyone was just exhausted with talking about it. And I think, unfortunately, as important as NHS campaigns are, they kind of tend to suffer from this because it's been something that we've been fighting for and campaigning around for such a long time. There's a kind of tiredness around it. And it's like, it's a real challenge. I don't have any answers, but it seems to be something that...
All right. Well, okay. Focusing on solutions, Ian, see if you can take us home on a good note, especially from the union point of view.
On a good note, but over the renationalisation of the whole country, I'm absolutely in favour of that. I mean, let's take British Steel over. Let's build all of our infrastructure with British Steel. Let's turn BBC into a broadcasting company that actually represents the wide-ranging political beliefs of this country, but give it equal measure. And if make it honest, and instead of going down a specific political viewpoint of those that the Tory party or those in politics appoint to it, make it truly independent. Make workers involved in the decision-making processes of their employers. Put a third of people from the workforce on a board, and a third of directors. And maybe put a third of the community on there too, because obviously what those companies do has an impact on what's happening in the wider society. So I think, when you talk about decision making, let's make people more involved. And that's what socialism is. That's what the nationalisation programme was. It was about making a joined up system that works in the interest of us all, that delivered and supported our ability to build homes, to provide healthcare, to give us free education, to enable us to retire with a decent pension, and to live a life without having to constantly rely on somebody donating to us through charity. And that's why I think the sooner we own the stuff that we produce, the sooner we control it, instead of sending it to private shareholders, the better.
Excellent. That's it. You did take us home, Ian. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate everyone in the audience.
Can I quickly just
John, go on then. Take us home, man.
Quickly, two things. The first thing is that the Brexit framing on this issue was clearly an express thing. We have no interest whatsoever in Brexit. I have spent the last 3 years of my life just really knocking my head around on the wall, just trying to avoid the discussion of Brexit. And obviously, the Express is looking for a way to kind of sell this, make their audience oppose NHS protection. Hence, they say it's about Brexit, right? So that's just one thing. And secondly, I used to live in Brighton, and I have to say, and if Ian were to do a little bit of a digging into me, he'll find that I'm a huge fan of the Bakers Union. And so I wanted to say congratulations. You guys do such amazing work. I'm so impressed. I think that every union should be like your union.
Yes. Another great way to end the show. And I couldn't agree more. Check if you are capable of joining the Bakers Union and support them. We can also do solidarity actions with them and in their struggles when they undertake them. And certainly don't be buying the divide and rule BS that the media sells us, especially when energetic unions like the Bakers Union undertake actions that don't just protect the interests of their own workers, but us as society in general. The rising tide lifts all boats. And although they're not explicitly allowed to say that they're striking not only for their members' benefits, but actually for wider society, they are. We all need unions like the Bakers Union. So I'm really proud to have had Ian on. I'm really chuffed to have had Natasha and Ian on as well. It's people like this that has made these shows great, but also make our society great and are building us up to the place that hopefully we can be instead of the place that we are now. I've been thoroughly excited with the show. We've got one last one next week. I'm really excited to invite you to that one. Come on down. Please do like, share, and stuff like that. People can watch this at any point. And do join our Telegram channel. Again, links are in the description on the YouTube channel. News Club UK, follow us, all that stuff. I know it's boring, but if you do it, it helps us get out to people who wouldn't otherwise see this stuff. And these guys are great. They deserve to be seen. Thank you very much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one. See you later.